He smiled at them before he killed them, and nobody knew his name until it was far too late. He wore the face of an ordinary man, a salesman, a husband, a father of two, a neighbor who kept to himself and caused no stir. He drove through the night streets of Brazil like a shadow moving through water, quiet and invisible, stopping only when he spotted the kind of woman the world had already agreed to forget. He smiled at them. He negotiated. He offered money. And then, deep in the darkness where no one would hear, he became something else entirely. Something that dragged a chain across the ground before wrapping it around a human throat. For nearly 2 decades, Paulo José Lisboa moved between cities, between prison walls, between identities, and between lives, leaving 11 confirmed dead bodies in his wake and a trail of horror so methodical, so deliberate, so chillingly calm that a psychiatrist would eventually look him in the eyes and describe him with one precise, devastating word: psychopath. This is not a story about a monster who looked like one. This is a story about a monster who looked exactly like you. Welcome, if you dare, to the true case of the man they called O Maniaco de Corrente. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. This story was put together through hours of careful research and attention to detail. Every part was thoughtfully crafted to create an immersive experience while approaching these real events with the seriousness and respect they deserve. The purpose of this channel is to keep these stories alive so they are not forgotten with time. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of Paulo José Lisboa, aka O Maniaco de Corrente, the chain maniac. Now let's begin. Some forms of evil do not stand out. They do not arrive with obvious warning signs or announce themselves through frightening appearances. Instead, they move comfortably through everyday life. They show up to work, exchange polite conversation, and earn the trust of the people around them. They know how to appear ordinary, reliable, even likable. That ability to blend in so completely, to become indistinguishable from everyone else, is what makes them so difficult to recognize and so dangerous when their true nature remains hidden. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Paulo José Lisboa was born in 1967 in Brazil, and from the very beginning, the life he constructed for himself was built on deception. Not the obvious, bumbling kind of deception that gets people caught, but the deep, architectural kind, the sort that is maintained over years, that has layers, that is reinforced daily by behavior so calculated it becomes almost indistinguishable from sincerity. He grew up to become a pharmaceutical salesman, a profession that required him to be charming, persuasive, and disarming. He was good at it. He moved through professional spaces with ease. He knew how to talk to people, how to gain their trust, how to make them feel at ease in his presence. He understood the mechanics of human vulnerability, and he used that understanding not to help people, but to destroy them. The city of São José do Rio Preto sits in the interior of São Paulo state, a mid-sized, industrious Brazilian city, far enough from the coastal glamour of São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro that its troubles rarely made national headlines. It was here, in the 1980s, that Paulo José Lisboa first began to kill. The decade was one of Brazil's most turbulent. Political upheaval, economic instability, rapid urbanization dragging millions of people into cities that weren't ready for them. The margins of society swelled. The streets at night filled with people who existed in the spaces between the visible and the invisible: sex workers, transvestites, people who survived by their wits in a world that offered them very little protection and even less mercy. Lisboa found them there. He sought them out with deliberate, predatory patience. His method was elegant in its horror. He would approach women or transvestites working as sex workers and arrange what appeared to be a standard transaction. He was calm. He was businesslike. He was not threatening. Why would they hesitate? He looked like a man who had somewhere to be afterward. He had the car of a professional, the manner of someone trustworthy. They got in. What happened next was swift and savage. Lisboa would drive them away from the populated streets, away from the lights, to places that were empty and dark and far from anyone who might intervene. Once there, the mask dropped. He opened the car door and pulled them out into the night. Some he attacked with a latch, a metal car door latch, a cold and brutal instrument swung with force into flesh and bone. Some he reached for his knife, driving the blade into bodies that had no time to understand what was happening. And some, those who lived long enough to feel the worst of it, he wrapped in chain. A heavy metal chain, the kind you'd use to lock a gate or secure machinery. He looped it. He tightened it. He watched life leave through it. It was this detail, the chain, always the chain as the final, defining instrument of his killing, that would eventually give him his name. Omaniaco de Correnti, the chain maniac. His first confirmed murders unfolded through the 1980s and into the 1990s in São José do Rio Preto. Investigators and police who later pieced together the timeline of his crimes were struck not just by their frequency but by their consistency. Lisboa was not erratic. He did not kill in a frenzy and then spiral into visible dysfunction. He killed, and then he went back to work. He returned to his routes as a salesman. He drove through the same streets. He interacted with the same colleagues and clients. The night lives he ended bled into the pavement and were washed away by the morning rain while he was already somewhere else, already smiling, already selling. Among the dead in São José do Rio Preto, 2 victims would later be publicly identified, their names pulling them briefly from the anonymity that their lives, and his crimes, had consigned them to. The first was Aline Mello, 15 years old. 15. A child who should have been thinking about what she would receive for Christmas, who should have been laughing with friends, who should have had years and years and years still ahead of her. On Christmas Day, 1987, Paulo José Lisboa stabbed Aline Mello 47 times. 47 times. The number alone is staggering. Not the work of a moment's violence, not an accident of rage, but a sustained, relentless attack on a young girl who had no chance. She was found later discarded. He was long gone. The second publicly identified victim was a transvestite named Paulo Constantino, who went by the name Paulinha. Like Aline, Paulinha was murdered with a knife. Her life taken by a man who had already decided that these were people who would not be missed, would not be searched for, would not be mourned loudly enough to bring consequence upon him. And for a time, a disgracefully long time, he was right. By the time law enforcement in São Paulo had built a case strong enough to arrest him, Lisboa had killed 5 people and violently assaulted 6 others in São José do Rio Preto. The attacks were not just murders. Several survivors carried injuries severe enough to mark them for life, their bodies bearing the evidence of what he had done even as the law slowly, painfully, caught up with what his hands had wrought. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. The sentence handed down was 18 years imprisonment, a significant penalty that should, in theory, have meant that Paulo José Lisboa would spend the better part of 2 decades behind bars, paying a debt to society that could never truly be paid. But court's sentence. Walls hold only as long as they are maintained. And Paulo José Lisboa had never been a man who accepted the boundaries others placed around him. He was transferred at some point to the Franco de Rocha psychiatric prison, a facility designed for those whose crimes had been connected to or complicated by psychiatric assessment. A psychiatric evaluation had already established what investigators suspected. Lisboa was a social psychopath. He was not delusional. He was not chaotic. His mind was clear and ordered and self-serving. He had no remorse because remorse requires an emotional architecture that he simply did not possess. He understood right from wrong in the abstract. He simply did not care. In 1998, Paulo José Lisboa escaped from Franco de Rocha. He walked out of whatever gap in the security presented itself to him. The exact details of his escape have never been comprehensively published, and he dissolved back into Brazil. He had served only a portion of his 18-year sentence. He was free. And the worst, in ways that the people of Sao Paulo's interior could not yet know, was still entirely ahead of him. When a man like Lisboa escapes, he does not stop. The impulse that drove him to those dark streets in the first place did not evaporate behind prison walls. If anything, confinement had compressed it, pressurized it, and release simply let it expand again. He moved. He traveled southeast, towards the coast, toward the state of Espírito Santo, a place where no one knew his face or his history, where the streets were new and so were the possibilities. His original plan, according to what would later emerge, was to pass through Espírito Santo and continue further north to Bahia. He never made it, because in Espírito Santo, in the beach town of Guarapari, where the Atlantic coast glittered and the streets smelled of salt, Paulo José Lisboa fell in love. The woman he met in Espírito Santo did not know who she was looking at. She saw a man, a stranger passing through, perhaps, someone with a quiet manner and a steady gaze, someone who made her feel seen. She had no knowledge of São José do Rio Preto. She had no knowledge of 5 dead bodies and 6 survivors whose lives had been cracked open by this man's hands. She knew nothing of a chain. She knew nothing of a prison escape. She knew only the person standing in front of her, the person who smiled at her, who spoke to her, who, in whatever way a man like Lisboa is capable of love, loved her. They married. They had 2 children together. Paulo José Lisboa, convicted killer, escaped psychiatric prisoner, holder of a soul that a court-appointed psychiatrist had formally assessed as belonging to a social psychopath, became a husband, became a father. Settled in a state where the sun rose warm over the Atlantic every morning, and no one on the street had the slightest reason to look at him with anything other than indifference. For a time, a brief, surreal, utterly wrong time, he appeared to be living a life. He established himself in the Greater Vitória region, the metropolitan area surrounding Espírito Santo's capital city. Greater Vitória is a sprawling urban cluster, a place of ports and industry and dense residential neighborhoods pressed up against the coast. It has its own shadows, its own streets that darken at night, its own population of marginalized people working in the spaces between visibility and law. And Paulo José Lisboa, husband and father, who had driven through the streets of São José do Rio Preto with murder in his hands, recognized those streets immediately. The killings in Espírito Santo began. The exact timeline is difficult to reconstruct with complete precision because Lisboa was operating under a false identity, a fugitive who had successfully vanished into a new geography, and because his victims, as in São Paulo, were sex workers and transvestites whose disappearances did not trigger the immediate, aggressive law enforcement response that might have slowed him sooner. He is known to have committed 6 further murders in the Greater Vitória region during the 10 years he lived as a fugitive in Espírito Santo. 6 more lives. 6 more people who climbed into his car under the impression that what was about to happen was a transaction, not an execution. His method had not changed. He was too methodical for that, too set in what had worked before. He approached. He negotiated. He gained their trust in the transactional way that made sense in that context. Money, time, a destination. He drove them somewhere isolated. And then he attacked. Sometimes the knife came first, fast, overwhelming, giving no time for the victim to understand or resist. Sometimes it was the latch. And sometimes, as always, the chain came last, coiled around the throat, pulled tight, completing what his hands had begun. He abandoned the bodies where they fell and drove back through the night into his other life, where children and a wife waited for him in a home that had no idea what it was sheltering. Among the additional crimes confirmed against him in Espírito Santo were 2 attempted murders, cases where his victims survived, where something in the equation changed enough that he could not finish what he started. Those survivors would matter enormously. Survivors always do. They are the ones who can speak when the dead cannot. They carry descriptions, recollections, fragments of truth that investigators need. And when the time came, those fragments would be part of what helped bring him down. But that time was still years away. Through the 1990s and into the first years of the new millennium, Paulo José Lisboa remained free. 10 full years of freedom as a fugitive. 10 years during which the families of 5 dead victims in São Paulo were denied justice. 10 years during which 6 new victims were added to his account. 10 years during which 2 children grew up calling a serial killer father. The mathematics of what that decade represents in human suffering, the murders, the attempted murders, the ongoing deception of the woman who had married him, is not something that can be fully calculated, can only be felt. During those years, law enforcement in São Paulo never stopped looking for him, but the search was hampered by geography and the reality of Brazil's vast interior. Lisboa had fled across state lines, changed his circumstances entirely, and, crucially, had managed to avoid the kind of high-profile visibility that might have led to recognition. He was not a man who drew attention to himself. That had always been his greatest skill. He was forgettable by design. In Guarapari and the surrounding areas, neighbors who would later be interviewed after his eventual arrest described him in terms that will be familiar to anyone who has studied this particular type of criminal. Quiet, kept to himself, never caused trouble, didn't socialize much. The profile of the invisible man, present but unnoticed, there but not there. He carried his secret in both hands every single day and set it down only in the dark, only in the places where no witness survived to speak about what they had seen. The 6 murders in Espírito Santo are documented, but the identities of those victims remain largely hidden from public record. A silence that is itself a form of injustice. These were human beings. They had names before Lisboa decided they were targets. They had histories before he decided they were disposable. The fact that their names have not been widely published does not diminish what was done to them. If anything, their anonymity, the very quality Lisboa counted on when he selected them, deserves to be acknowledged, because it is precisely that anonymity that made them vulnerable to him in the first place. By 2008, Paulo José Lisboa was 51 years old. He had been a free man for a decade. He had a wife, 2 children, a home in a coastal state far from where his crimes had begun. He had been convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to 18 years, escaped that sentence, and added 6 more deaths to his record while living under the radar of law enforcement from a different state. He had, by any measure, beaten the system, not through cleverness that was beyond the system's reach, but through the system's own gaps, its own exhaustions, its own inability to fully coordinate across the geography of an enormous country. But the walls were closing in, slowly, steadily, with the grinding persistence of investigators who had not forgotten, who had filed the paperwork away but not shut the file, who were still, even years later, following threads. And in September of 2008, those threads finally reached him. September 16, 2008. The city of Vitória, capital of Espírito Santo, where the Atlantic wind moves through the streets and the day begins like any other day in a city that does not know it is about to close a chapter of terror that has been open for over 20 years. Paulo José Lisboa was arrested. The specifics of his capture, how investigators finally located him, what intelligence or tip or procedural breakthrough brought them to his door, have not been laid out in granular public detail. What is known is the result. He was found, identified, taken into custody on that September morning, and the fugitive who had spent 10 years building a second life in Espírito Santo was no longer free. The man who had walked out of Franco de Rocha psychiatric prison in 1998 was back in handcuffs, facing the full weight of what he had done. Not just in São José do Rio Preto, but in the streets of Greater Vitória where 6 more people had died because the system had failed to hold him. What happened in the immediate aftermath of his arrest was, to investigators familiar with criminal psychology, perhaps not entirely surprising, but still chilling in its clarity. Paulo José Lisboa confessed, not reluctantly, not after extensive interrogation, not in fragments coerced over hours of legal pressure. He admitted his crimes with the kind of directness that belongs to a man who has ordered his thoughts, who has assessed the situation and determined that denial is no longer useful. He explained his methods. He described how he operated, the approach, the negotiation, the drive, the attack. He told investigators what he used to kill and how he used it. And then, with a calmness that would later be cited in his psychiatric assessment, he offered his explanation for why he chose sex workers and transvestites as his targets. He said they were easy targets. That was his phrase, the full scope of his moral calculation, rendered in 3 words. Easy targets. Not complicated. Not hidden behind layers of psychological distortion. just the cold, functional reasoning of a man who had identified a category of human being that the world would not fight hard to protect, and had exploited that vulnerability for 2 decades. The psychiatric examination that followed his arrest reached a formal conclusion. Paulo José Lisboa was a social psychopath. The diagnosis placed him in a category of offenders whose defining characteristic is not an inability to understand social norms, but a fundamental absence of the emotional investment those norms are supposed to produce. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew that other people suffered from what he inflicted. He simply experienced none of the internal deterrence, empathy, remorse, guilt, fear of consequence, that prevent most human beings from crossing into violence. The chain in his hands was not the product of a broken mind that couldn't tell fantasy from reality. It was the product of a mind that was perfectly clear about reality and had chosen this. The case that went before the courts was built on his confessions, the evidence gathered across 2 states, the testimonies of investigators who had followed his trail through São Paulo and Espírito Santo, and whatever corroborating physical evidence remained from the crimes committed during his decade as a fugitive. The trial was not, given the weight of his own admissions, a matter of establishing what he had done. The question before the court was what would be done about it. For the crimes committed in Espírito Santo, the 6 murders and 2 attempted murders carried out while he was a fugitive, Justice Daniel Picanha Moreira sentenced Paulo José Lisboa to 10 years imprisonment in a closed-regime facility. This sentence, added to the earlier conviction from São Paulo, should have meant a substantial stretch behind bars. The São Paulo sentence alone had been 18 years. He had escaped after serving only a fraction of it. In total, across both convictions, the 18 years for the São Paulo crimes and the additional sentence for Espírito Santo, Lisboa faced a legal reckoning that his years of freedom had only deferred, never erased. But Brazilian sentencing law and penal arithmetic are complex, and the practical reality of how his sentences combined and were served meant that by 2017, 9 years after his 2008 arrest, Paulo José Lisboa was released from prison. He was paroled. He walked out under supervision, a free man again, at approximately 50 years of age, carrying the bodies of 11 confirmed victims and the quiet, undisturbed internal world of a man who had never once felt that what he did was wrong. 11 victims, 11 lives, 5 killed in São José do Rio Preto over the course of more than a decade, including 15-year-old Aline Melo, stabbed 47 times on Christmas Day. 6 more killed in Espírito Santo while he lived his secret life as a husband and father. 6 people he selected, transported, brutalized, and discarded in the dark streets of Greater Vitória while his children slept at home and his wife trusted the man beside her. And 6 people he had attacked in São Paulo who survived, who carried the physical and psychological wreckage of encounters with him and who will never fully set it down. The crime scene photographs, the autopsy reports, the survivor accounts that exist within Brazilian police and legal archives represent a record of carnage that spans more than 20 years of active predation. Lisboa was not an impulsive killer who struck once or twice in a moment of rage. He was systematic. He was patient. He selected the same type of victim again and again, used the same method again and again, disposed of bodies in the same disconnected way again and again. In the language of criminal behavioral analysis, he was organized, fully aware of what he was doing, fully capable of covering his tracks, fully in control of every element of his kills. That control is what makes his case so chilling. Rage burns itself out. Compulsion can be disrupted. But calculation, cold, clear, undisturbed calculation, endures. The name O Maníaco de Corrente had entered the public consciousness of Brazil long before his 2008 arrest. The chain was his signature, the detail that gave investigators and journalists a handle on his crimes, a phrase that could be uttered and immediately conjure the image of what he had done. In São José do Rio Preto, where his early killings had stirred fear in the community of sex workers who knew that something was hunting them on those nighttime streets, the name had circulated before his first arrest. And in Espírito Santo, where his crimes during the fugitive years were being investigated without, initially, full awareness of who was committing them, the pattern of the chain eventually became a thread connecting cases that might otherwise have seemed separate. What the chain represented, beyond its function as a weapon, was a kind of terrible signature, a detail so specific, so distinctive, that it identified his work the way a brushstroke identifies a painter. He left it behind not as a message, not as a trophy, not as a deliberate taunt to investigators, but simply because it was how he killed. The chain was not a statement. It was a method, and that made it, if anything, more disturbing. Not the flourish of someone performing, but the tool of someone working. After his release from prison in 2017, Paulo José Lisboa did what perhaps no one who knew his history would have predicted, or perhaps exactly what anyone who understood his nature would have expected. He disappeared back into ordinary life. He remarried. Whether this was the same woman from his fugitive years in Espírito Santo or a new relationship formed after his release is not entirely clear from available records. What is clear is that he established a domestic situation once again, building the architecture of normalcy around himself the way he always had, with the practiced ease of a man who understood that the best camouflage is not invisibility but ordinariness. He moved to Guarapari, the coastal Espírito Santo town where his fugitive chapter had partly unfolded, and he settled. Neighbors, in the accounts that emerged after events would bring his name back into the news, described him the way neighbors always described him. He kept to himself. He did not interact much with the people around him. He avoided the kind of social engagement that might lead someone to ask questions, to learn things, to connect his face to a name that Brazilian crime journalists had written about at length during the years of his trials. He existed in the narrow channel between presence and absence, taking up just enough space to appear normal and just little enough to avoid scrutiny. He was supervised as a condition of his parole. Brazilian law requires that offenders released under supervision maintain contact with the relevant authorities, comply with conditions of release, and refrain from further criminal activity. Whether that supervision was maintained with the rigor that someone of Lisboa's history warranted is a question that cannot be answered simply from available public records. What can be said is that no further criminal charges appear to have been brought against him during his post-release years. If the impulse that had driven him to kill 11 people across 2 decades and 2 states remained alive within him, and nothing in the psychological literature on social psychopathy suggests it would simply evaporate, it does not appear to have translated into documented criminal action during the 5 years between his release and his death. Those 5 years are largely a blank in the public record. He moved through them somewhere between the visible and invisible, as he always had, in a beach town on the coast of Espírito Santo, with a wife and a new chapter that no one around him had any context to understand. The people of Guarapari who passed him on the street did not know that the quiet man in their neighborhood had wrapped a chain around 11 throats. They did not know that in São José do Rio Preto, a young girl named Aline had been stabbed 47 times on Christmas morning by the hands that now reached for ordinary things at an ordinary market in their ordinary town. They did not know, and he gave them no reason to find out. February 4th, 2022. The date is recorded now in the files of a case that ended not with justice administered in a courtroom or a final reckoning of any conventional kind, but in mystery. His wife had been away, visiting relatives in the nearby city of Vila Velha. She returned home to Guarapari and found her husband dead. Not killed, not arrested, not gone in some way that offered a clear explanation, just dead. His body had already begun to decompose, which meant he had been dead for some time before she found him. He was 54 or 55 years old. Omaniaco de Corrente, the pharmaceutical salesman who had killed 11 people with knives and chains and metal latches across 2 Brazilian states, who had escaped a psychiatric prison and lived a decade as a fugitive, who had married, fathered children, confessed, served time, been released and remarried, died in his home, and coroners who examined him were unable to establish a cause of death. Unable to establish a cause of death. In a case built on so much documentation, so many details, so much recorded horror, that final sentence lands like the closing of a door that leaves too many things on the other side of it. The man who had killed with such method and precision, who had been so careful and so clinical about the deaths he caused, exited the world without a clear explanation. No one knows exactly what ended Paulo José Lisboa. The coroner could not say. There is something profoundly unsettling about that ending. Not because it represents any injustice, the time for addressing that had passed, for better or worse, through the legal system years earlier, but because it is so entirely in keeping with the dissonance that ran through his entire life. A man who caused so much chaos and grief died in the quiet of his own home in a way that no one could fully account for. The story that began in the night streets of interior Sao Paulo in the 1980s, with a pharmaceutical salesman and a chain and a darkness that would spread across 2 decades, ended in silence, in decomposition, in a room in Guarapari where the Atlantic wind came off the ocean and the neighbors still didn't know. For the 11 people who died at his hands, their ends were neither quiet nor peaceful. Aline Mello was 15 years old on Christmas Day, 1987, when she received 47 knife wounds from a man who left her where she fell and drove back through the night. Paolo Constantino, whose full story and history have never been publicly chronicled in the detail they deserve, died at his hands as well. 9 others, their names not widely recorded. Their lives ended in the shadows of Sao Paulo and Espírito Santo by a man who chose them because he believed no one would care enough to come for him. For the 6 survivors who lived through his attacks in São José do Rio Preto, who woke up in hospitals with injuries that bore the map of what his hands could do, there is no clean ending either. Survival is not resolution. They carry what happened to them every day in ways that no parole, no sentencing, no death of an offender can undo. The case of Paulo José Lisboa raises questions that do not have easy answers. How does a man convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years escape from a psychiatric prison after serving only a fraction of that time, and then spend a full decade in a neighboring state committing 6 more murders before anyone catches up with him? How does the architecture of a justice system allow that gap to exist, the gap through which 11 lives fell? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the kind that Brazilian criminologists and legal scholars have had reason to ask not just in this case but in several others, where the vulnerabilities of a vast, complex system allowed violence to continue long past the point where it should have been stopped. For the sex workers and transvestites who populated the streets of São José do Rio Preto and Greater Vitoria during the years Lisboa operated, the fear he generated was specific and particular, targeted at a community already navigating extreme vulnerability, already existing at the margins of legal protection, already aware that the structures designed to keep people safe were not reliably extended to them. Lisboa knew this. He said so explicitly. Easy targets. He chose them because he understood, with perfect social predator's clarity, that the system would be slower to respond to their deaths. That slower response cost lives. It is a truth that sits at the center of his case and cannot be separated from the full understanding of how he operated and why he continued for as long as he did. Omaniaco de Carente is gone now. He died on a February day in 2022 in a coastal town, in a home where the walls knew nothing of what they were sheltering. The investigation into his cause of death appears to have concluded without resolution. Another closed file that leaves too many questions unanswered in a case already overflowing with them. The man who hid behind ordinariness, who killed behind the mask of a transaction, who fled across state lines and began again and killed again and was caught again and eventually released and began again one more time, is gone. But the names he left behind, the 11 who cannot speak, the 6 who survived with wounds that no years could fully close, remain. Aline Mello, Paulinha, and 9 others whose names the world has not yet fully learned. They were there before he was. They deserved to be there long after him. That they are not, that his hands reached into their futures and took those futures away, is the fact that outlasts every other detail of this case. The chain is silent now. The maniac is gone. What remains is the reckoning. Quiet, unfinished, and impossible to fully complete, of what it costs when the wrong kind of man walks through the world undetected, and the systems that should stop him open the door instead. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Glacier of Death. How a quiet repairman became Brazil's most depraved child killer, aka the monster of Rio Claro, the vampire, Darcy Nogueira. He fixed your windows by day and shattered the lives of children by night. And the most terrifying part? Every single person who knew him called him a good man. Imagine a man so ordinary, so impossibly forgettable, that neighbors praised his name at dinner tables, mothers smiled and waved at him from their doorsteps, and children, innocent, trusting, unsuspecting children, willingly followed him into the dark. He wasn't loud. He wasn't strange. He didn't stink of danger the way evil is supposed to. He repaired glass for a living, the fragile, transparent kind. And there is something unbearably ironic about that, because the glass he shattered was not the kind you could ever put back together. We are talking about Francisco de Marco, born in 1922 in Brazil, a man who would leave an open wound across 3 decades of Brazilian history, a wound that refused to close each time authorities foolishly believed it had healed. He was sentenced not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. He escaped from prison. He fabricated a new identity. He moved across states. He smiled at new neighbors. He found new children. And then he killed again. What you are about to hear is not fiction. This is not a thriller novel or a scripted nightmare. This is the documented, verified, blood-soaked truth of the man whose crimes were so vile, so relentless, so darkly calculated, that an entire region of Brazil still carries the psychological scars. This is the story of the glacier, the monster, the vampire, and the children who never came home. There is a particular type of evil that history has always struggled to recognize, not because it is subtle, but because it wears the most convincing disguise ever constructed: normalcy. Francisco de Marco understood this instinctively, whether by design or by the cold mechanics of his own fractured psychology. He perfected the art of appearing harmless in a world that desperately wanted to believe that monsters announce themselves. They do not. They never have. Born in 1922 somewhere in Brazil, De Marco's earliest years are buried beneath decades of silence and incomplete records. What is known is skeletal but damning. Before the murders that would eventually brand his name into the national consciousness, he had already been convicted of unspecified sexual crimes as an adult, crimes serious enough to earn him a prison sentence of 3 years. 3 years. He served them, walked out, and the world extended to him the grace it so often extends to dangerous men: a second chance wrapped in willful ignorance. After his release, sometime in the late 1940s or perhaps the early 1950s, Francisco de Marco did not retreat into obscurity or exile himself in shame. He did the opposite. He rebuilt. He moved to Marília, a municipality in the state of São Paulo, a place of modest streets and working-class dignity. He married. He fathered 3 children of his own. He settled into domestic life with an ease that, in retrospect, is deeply unsettling. And he found work as a glazier, a man who cuts and installs glass, who moves through neighborhoods with legitimate purpose, who enters the periphery of people's homes and lives without triggering alarm. It was the perfect occupation for what he truly was. Neighbors remembered him with uncomplicated warmth. Humble, they said, peaceful, hard-working. A man who earned his bread honestly and kept to himself in all the right ways. None of them, not a single soul in that community, knew about the convictions behind him. None of them knew what lived beneath the quiet surface of that unremarkable face. And it is precisely that communal blindness, that shared assumption of goodness, that Francisco de Marco would exploit with devastating efficiency. March 1st, 1953. That date is carved permanently into the history of Marília, into the grief of one family in particular, and into the broader and terrible catalogue of Brazilian criminal history. It was a day that began like any other and ended with the discovery of something no community should ever have to face. Her name was Iracema Rubino dos Santos. She was 7 years old. Her family were neighbors of Francisco de Marco, people who trusted him, who had no reason not to, who perhaps smiled when they saw him coming down the street. On that March day, DeMarco approached little Iracema with a proposition that would have seemed entirely reasonable to a child of that era. He needed help with the harvest in a nearby cornfield, and would she come along to assist? She said yes. Of course she did. He was the neighbor, the glazier, the quiet, harmless man. What happened in that cornfield exists now only in court records and in the grief that Iracema's family has carried for over 70 years. DeMarco led the 7-year-old child away from the safety of her home, into the tall, concealing rows of corn, and there he committed an act of sexual violence against her that is almost impossible to describe with the composure this narrative demands. He raped her. He was a grown man. She was 7. And when it was over, when whatever dark impulse had driven him to that place had been satisfied, he placed his hands around her throat and asphyxiated her. He choked the life out of a 7-year-old child with the same hands he used to cut glass. He then carried her small body to a farm behind the town stadium and left it there, discarded with the casual indifference of someone depositing refuse. Perhaps he believed she would not be found quickly. Perhaps he believed he had been careful enough. He had not. Authorities moved with relatively swift purpose given the era. The similarities between DeMarco's behavior and the crime, the proximity, the opportunity, the timing, converged quickly enough to focus suspicion. He was arrested and brought before the justice system, which sentenced him to 20 years in prison for the murder of Iracema Rubino dos Santos. 20 years for the rape and murder of a 7-year-old child. He was sent to the Morelia Public Jail to serve his sentence. He had other plans. Francisco DeMarco proved to be, in the eyes of prison administrators, a model inmate. Cooperative, quiet, disciplined, precisely the performance one would expect from a man who had already demonstrated his capacity for calculated deception. His behavior earned him privileges, and those privileges, with ruthless intelligence that the prison system entirely failed to anticipate, he used to escape confinement after serving just 3 years of his 20-year sentence. 3 years. For the rape and murder of a 7-year-old girl. He walked away from justice after 3 years. What follows is the chapter that Brazilian society might have prevented. Had the system held, had the walls been stronger, had someone somewhere understood what Francisco DeMarco actually was. But they did not. And so he vanished. He moved. He drifted. He crossed the invisible borders between Sao Paulo and the neighboring state of Minas Gerais, traveling to the municipality of Ponte Nova, a town that had no record of him, no awareness of what had happened in Morelia, no reason to be afraid of the quiet, polite stranger who arrived looking for work and a place to rest. There, with the ease of a man who had done it before, he constructed a new identity. He called himself Darcy Nogueira, a new name, a new face, the same predator underneath. By 1961, 8 years after the murder of Iracema, he struck again. The first victim in Ponte Nova was a 14-year-old girl whose name has not been preserved in the records with the completeness she deserved. She remains known only as unidentified, a haunting designation that compounds the tragedy of her death. DeMarco shot her with a garrucha, a crude, locally manufactured pistol common in rural Brazil at the time, under circumstances that the record describes only as unclear. What is clear is that she was a child, and he killed her, and he did so with the same methodical absence of remorse that had defined his actions in Morelia nearly a decade earlier. But this time there was a witness. A young boy named Antonio Carlos Fernandez was present when DeMarco fired that shot. He saw what happened. He saw the man who called himself Darcy Nogueira end a girl's life. And he survived, at least initially. Perhaps he ran. Perhaps he was too stunned to move, and DeMarco calculated that the child was too young, too frightened, too uncertain to present any real threat. Whatever the reasoning, DeMarco allowed the boy to walk away in that moment. It was a decision driven not by mercy but by the cold arithmetic of a predator who believed he could neutralize any problem on his own schedule. And his schedule, it turned out, was swift and without hesitation. 1 week later, Antonio Carlos Fernandez was dead. DeMarco tracked him down with the focused determination of a man who saw loose ends as intolerable inconveniences. He found the boy, raped him with the same brutality he had visited upon Iracema 8 years prior, and then shot him twice in the head. 2 bullets, close range, to silence the only witness to his previous crime. As if that were not enough, as if the killing itself were insufficient to satisfy whatever drove him. He then set the boy's body on fire. He burned Antonio Carlos Fernandez, a child who had done nothing except be in the wrong place, to ash. The level of deliberation required to commit these acts is important to sit with for a moment. This was not impulse erupting without forethought. This was planning. DeMarco identified the threat. He located the threat. He waited the appropriate interval. He executed his solution, and then he attempted to destroy the evidence. This was a man who thought, who calculated, who weighed risk and acted accordingly. The mask of the humble glazier was not just a surface covering. It was a fully integrated operating strategy. After the murder of Fernandez, DeMarco fled Ponte Nova and made for Guaxup, another Sao Paulo municipality. But the net had tightened. Authorities, following the trail of 2 murders and the connecting thread of a stranger in town answering the description of someone who had been there for both, apprehended him. He was brought in without violence. The quiet man did not resist. For the murders of the unidentified girl and Antonio Carlos Fernandez, the Brazilian court system sentenced Francisco DeMarco to an additional 30 years in prison. Added to the 20 he had already received, and mostly failed to serve, the weight of justice was now theoretically substantial. He was transferred through several prisons across the state of Sao Paulo, beginning a long institutionalized journey that the authorities believed would contain him permanently this time. They were wrong to believe that. What the story of Francisco DeMarco demonstrates with painful clarity is that the danger was never purely in his freedom. It was in the persistent, systemic failure of the institutions that processed him. A man convicted of sexual crimes before his first murder. A man who escaped prison after serving a fraction of his sentence for rape and murder. A man who constructed a false identity and killed twice more in a different state. Each failure compounded the one before it, and none of them were invisible in retrospect. They were documented. They were part of the record. The record simply was not consulted with sufficient urgency. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, DeMarco remained imprisoned. He moved through the system's facilities, carrying his history with him in files that someone somewhere was responsible for reading and acting upon. He grew older behind bars. He was, by all external measures, contained. Communities breathed easier. The name Francisco DeMarco faded from the front pages of newspapers. Grief, over time, retreats into private rooms where it lives quietly, attended only by those who lost the most. But the story was not over. It was nowhere near over. By early 1981, Francisco DeMarco was incarcerated at the Carandiru Penitentiary, one of Brazil's most notorious correctional facilities, a place that would itself become the subject of a separate and equally dark chapter of national history decades later. At Carandiru, in a decision that remains almost incomprehensible in light of what the authorities already knew about this man, Francisco DeMarco was granted parole. Parole. After everything. The conditions attached to this release required that he be supervised by family members. He was to live under familial oversight, to be monitored, to be kept within boundaries that the state apparently trusted his relatives to enforce. He was sent to Rio Claro, a city in Sao Paulo state, where family members received him into their home as required. What the authorities could not have anticipated was what Francisco DeMarco was already planning the moment the gates of Carandiru closed behind him. He was 59 years old. He had spent a significant portion of his adult life in prison. He had murdered at least 3 children across 2 different states, and he had learned precisely nothing that might redirect the hunger that had driven every terrible choice he had ever made. He began hunting immediately. Rio Claro had no idea what had just arrived in its midst. The city's children played in its streets, attended school, ran errands, lived with the uncomplicated freedom of young people who have been given no reason to believe that danger could take the shape of a soft-spoken older man with a gentle manner and a pocket full of sweets. Francisco DeMarco understood this. He had always understood this. Children trust adults. That trust is the foundation of childhood itself, the mechanism through which they learn and grow and survive. And he had weaponized that trust before. He did it again. His method in Rio Claro was refined by years of experience. He located children on the streets, shoeshiners, young workers, children simply moving through their days, and approached them with offers of candy and sweetness, with promises of fruit to be picked at an abandoned farmhouse nearby. The farmhouse was key. It was isolated. It was removed from the noise and the eyes of the neighborhood. It was where Francisco DeMarco intended to do what Francisco DeMarco had always done. And it is there that the second and final wave of his killing would begin. A wave that would not break until 4 more children were dead and an entire city was paralyzed with a fear it struggled to name, because the name was sitting right there among them, eating dinner, sleeping under a family roof, collecting his pension of continued freedom while the children of Rio Claro disappeared one by one into the silence of an abandoned farmhouse and a predator's patience. There is a particular horror embedded in the moment a child accepts something sweet from a dangerous hand. It is a horror not because the child has done anything wrong. Children are not responsible for the failures of adults who are supposed to protect them, but because of what it reveals about the architecture of predation. Francisco DeMarco had spent decades understanding this architecture. He had studied it from the inside, lived within it, refined his understanding each time the system failed to permanently remove him from the world of children. By the time he arrived in Rio Claro on parole in 1981, he was not a man restarting his life. He was a predator completing a circuit. Rio Claro in the early 1980s was a mid-sized Brazilian city, alive with the ordinary rhythms of provincial life. Markets and churches and schools and soccer fields. Children who shined shoes on corners to help their families earn. Children who ran messages for neighbors, who played football in dusty lots, who moved through their days with the fragile confidence of young people who have been sheltered enough to believe the world is mostly kind. Francisco DeMarco settled into this landscape with practiced invisibility. His family, fulfilling the conditions of his parole, had given him a room and a daily structure. To those who saw him, and there were many who did, he was simply an elderly man, white-haired by now, slightly built, with the manner of someone who had seen a great deal of life and required very little from anyone around him. He was 60 years old. Nobody was watching him the way they should have been. The abandoned farmhouse he selected as his location was a calculated choice. DeMarco understood space the way a hunter understands terrain. Not academically but viscerally, from the gut-level knowledge of a man who has used isolation as a tool multiple times across multiple decades. The farmhouse sat at a remove from the residential streets, far enough that sounds would not carry, close enough that a child could be guided there on foot without the journey itself becoming suspicious. He sweetened the approach with candy and the promise of fruit picking. Wholesome activities dressed in the language of an older generation's childhood. The first murder in Rio Claro occurred on October 22, 1982. The victim's name was Alberto Antonio Antonelli. He was 11 years old. He worked as a shoeshiner. One of those children whose small labor contributed to a family's survival. Children who knew the streets of their city with the confidence of young workers. Children who had learned to read strangers well enough to navigate commerce, but not well enough to recognize what Francisco DeMarco truly was. Alberto encountered the older man and accepted whatever offer was extended. The details of their exchange are not fully documented, but the pattern was by now entirely consistent with everything DeMarco had done before. An approach, an offer, a reason that seemed benign, a walk toward somewhere private. Alberto followed. They reached the abandoned farmhouse. And then the child experienced something that no court record can fully convey, and that no writer should attempt to describe without acknowledging first that what happened there was a violation of a magnitude that diminishes language entirely. DeMarco sexually assaulted and asphyxiated Alberto Antonio Antonelli. He then, in an act of mutilation that would become a signature of his crimes against male victims, emasculated the boy. He removed the child's genitals. This detail is not included for sensationalism. It is included because it is part of the documented factual record, because it defines the specific and particular depth of cruelty that characterized Francisco DeMarco's crimes, and because the families and the investigators who faced these scenes deserve to have the truth of what they confronted acknowledged with unflinching honesty. DeMarco disposed of Alberto's body in the Edmundo Navarro de Andrade State Forest, a sprawling area of eucalyptus trees that borders Rio Claro, a place of natural beauty that became something else entirely in the years that followed. A forest where things were hidden. A forest where children were left. Alberto Antonio Antonelli, 11 years old, a shoeshine, a son, gone. The city of Rio Claro absorbed this loss with the terrible confusion of a community that does not yet understand what it is dealing with. A missing child, a body in the forest. A crime that appeared to have no immediate perpetrator, no witness confrontation, no obvious chain of evidence leading directly back to any particular door. Police investigations began. Families prayed. And Francisco DeMarco, living with his family as required by his parole conditions, continued his routine without visible interruption. He did not wait long before striking again. Jose Noguera Neto was 9 years old. He too disappeared from the streets of Rio Claro in the period following Alberto's murder, sometime in the remainder of 1982 or early 1983. The record preserves his name but is less complete regarding the precise timing of his death, a gap that speaks to how overwhelmed and under-resourced local investigators were as multiple disappearances began to accumulate without apparent resolution. Jose was lured in the same fashion. Sweets, promises, the farmhouse. DeMarco raped and asphyxiated the 9-year-old boy and mutilated him as he had mutilated Alberto, and the body was left in the fields. Sugarcane this time, not forest, the tall green stalks closing over the evidence like water over a stone. 2 children, both gone in ways that left communities terrified and law enforcement scrambling without the piece of the puzzle they needed most: the identity of the person responsible. The crimes shared characteristics: the proximity to Rio Claro, the age of the victims, the method of killing. But without a suspect clearly in frame, the investigation moved forward slowly against the weight of its own uncertainty. Maria Marcia de Lima Carvalho was 9 years old. A girl this time, departing from the pattern of male victims in Rio Claro, which demonstrates that DeMarco's compulsions were not narrowly limited by gender, but by opportunity and access. She was approached by the elderly man with the gentle manner and the offers of sweetness. Parents were pulling their children from the streets. Conversations at markets and on front porches had turned frightened and hushed. Something was happening in their city. Something methodical, something patient, something that did not announce itself or leave the obvious traces of disorganization that a panicked or impulsive killer might. This was precision. This was experience. This was someone who had done this before many times and who knew exactly how to move without being immediately caught. Loisir da Silva was 11 years old. He was the 4th child killed in Rio Claro in early 1984, and his murder followed the pattern with such exact repetition that it was almost, in the most horrible possible sense, mechanical. The approach, the inducement, the farmhouse, the assault, the asphyxiation, the mutilation, the sugarcane field. DeMarco had reduced the taking of a child's life to a sequence of steps that he had practiced and repeated with the cold fluency of something learned so thoroughly it had become reflex. 4 children dead in Rio Claro across roughly a year and a half. Alberto, 11. Jose, 9. Maria Marcia, 9. Loisir, 11. Each one approached by the same man. Each one trusting enough to follow. Each one left broken and discarded in the green spaces around a city that was by now deeply, collectively afraid. The investigators working these cases in Rio Claro were not without perception. The similarities between the murders were impossible to miss. The age of the victims, the method of killing, the disposal in fields and forests, the specific mutilation of the male victims. But the connective thread that would eventually unravel everything. The thread that led back to a name, back to a history, back to a prison record and a parole condition and a quiet elderly man living with his family, had not yet surfaced. It would not surface for a while longer. In the meantime, the farmhouse waited. And DeMarco moved through his days in Rio Claro with the same performance of ordinariness that had served him for over 30 years. Neighbors saw what they were meant to see. Family members, perhaps, saw what they needed to see. The elderly man sat in his room, walked his street, received whatever small acknowledgments life extended to him, and planned his next approach with a patience that now, in hindsight, reads as something beyond simply calculated. It reads as obsessive, compulsive, as though the driving force within him was not something he chose but something he was enslaved to. A darkness so deeply embedded in his architecture that not even 62 years of life, not even decades of imprisonment, not even the documented and consequential aftermath of his previous crimes had done anything to diminish it. When asked years later why he had done what he had done, Francisco DeMarco would offer an answer so barren of accountability that it functions almost as a kind of testament to the depth of his detachment. He said simply that he sometimes lost his mind and went looking for children. Not remorse, not explanation, a statement delivered with the casual flatness of someone describing the weather. He sometimes lost his mind and went looking for children. 4 of those children in Rio Claro were dead because he went looking. The investigation that would eventually reach Francisco DeMarco began its critical acceleration in May 1984, when the mounting murders finally achieved the national attention they had long deserved. Brazilian news outlets began reporting on the disappearances and deaths of children in Rio Claro with the persistent urgency that mass public awareness creates. Investigators from Marília, the city where DeMarco had committed his very first documented murder in 1953, 31 years earlier, began paying attention to the reports from Rio Claro with a particular and specialized interest. The similarities were not subtle. The victims were children. The method involved sexual violence followed by asphyxiation. The male victims had been mutilated in a specific way. The bodies were left in isolated natural locations. For the detectives in Marília who still held the file of Iracema Rubino dos Santos, the 7-year-old girl DeMarco had killed and dumped behind the stadium 3 decades before, the pattern did not just suggest a connection. They pulled the old records. They compared the details. They traced what they knew of Francisco DeMarco's movements through the prison system, through his parole status, through the condition requiring him to live with family in Rio Claro. The arithmetic of geography and chronology aligned with terrible neatness. The children of Rio Claro had begun dying within months of Francisco DeMarco's arrival on parole. The method was his method. The locations were consistent with his known preferences for isolation. A warrant was prepared. Officers moved toward Rio Claro. And in June 1984, in a scene almost jarringly anticlimactic given the magnitude of what this man had done, Francisco DeMarco was taken into custody without resistance. The quiet man did not fight. He simply allowed himself to be arrested, as though he had been expecting the knock on the door and had decided, on some level, that the performance of cooperation was still the wisest available strategy. He was 62 years old. He had murdered at least 7 children across 3 decades, and he was finally off the streets for the last time. There is a moment in every major criminal investigation where the physical evidence stops being abstract and becomes something almost unbearable to process, where the items recovered from a search are no longer just exhibits in a legal proceeding but the personal, intimate artifacts of people who can no longer speak for themselves. The search of Francisco DeMarco's room in Rio Claro produced 2 such items, and they functioned together as a portrait of guilt so complete that the courtroom proceedings that followed were, in a sense, a formality built upon evidence that had already rendered its own verdict. The first item was a shoeshine brush. It had belonged to Alberto Antonio Antonelli, the 11-year-old shoeshiner who had been DeMarco's first victim in Rio Claro, killed on October 22, 1982. His body left in the Edmundo Navarro de Andrade State Forest. Alberto had carried that brush as a tool of his livelihood. He had used it on the streets of Rio Claro to earn small amounts of money to supplement whatever his family needed. It was the instrument of his daily life. And it was sitting in the room of the man who had raped and murdered and mutilated him, kept there as what could only be described as a trophy, an artifact retained from the scene of an atrocity by the person who committed it. The second item was a collection of PVC pipes. Investigators had already found PVC pipes discarded near the bodies of the male victims. Instruments of sodomy, deployed in the assault of children whose suffering had already been taken as far as DeMarco's depravity could take it. The pipes in his room were identical to those found at the disposal sites. The connection was not circumstantial. It was direct. The same man, the same objects, the same crimes. These 2 pieces of evidence, recovered from the living space of a man on parole who had been entrusted to family supervision, told a story with a clarity that words rarely match. Francisco DeMarco had not just committed these murders. He had held onto pieces of them. He had kept them close. He had lived alongside the relics of his crimes with the apparent comfort of a man who felt no need to purge his environment of what he had done, either because he felt no genuine danger of being caught, or because possession of these items served some psychological function too dark and too specific to speculate upon with any precision. When confronted with the evidence, DeMarco did not deny involvement. He did not construct an elaborate alternative narrative. He offered instead the statement that has since become the most quoted summation of his self-understanding. He sometimes lost his mind and went looking for children. 7 words of such profound emptiness that they function not as a confession of remorse but as a window into a psyche that had never, not once in 62 years of living, developed the internal architecture through which remorse might travel. He did not express grief for the children. He did not acknowledge the enormity of what he had taken from them and from their families. He described his crimes the way a man might describe a compulsive habit. Something that happened to him, something he experienced rather than chose, something that arrived without announcement and for which he appeared to assign himself no more moral weight than he would assign to a sneeze. Investigators and prosecutors who built the case against Francisco DeMarco in 1984 were working against a backdrop of national horror. The murders in Rio Claro had received wide coverage by the time of his arrest, and the revelation that the perpetrator was not a shadowy unknown figure but a man on parole. A man with a documented criminal history stretching back to 1953, a man who had been given parole and supervision and had used both to kill again, transformed the horror into something with an institutional dimension that was nearly as disturbing as the crimes themselves. The question that prosecutors and commentators alike were asking, the question that the public had every right to ask, was a simple one. How? How had Francisco DeMarco been granted parole? How had a man convicted of the rape and murder of a 7-year-old girl in 1953, who had then escaped from prison, then committed 2 additional murders in a different state under a false identity, been deemed suitable for supervised release in 1981? What review process had been applied? Who had evaluated the risk? What had been weighed against what? The answers were deeply uncomfortable and pointed toward a system stretched thin by capacity, bureaucratic inertia, the passage of time between crimes, and perhaps a cultural tendency to believe, against all available evidence, that age diminishes danger. Francisco DeMarco at 60 was not a diminished man. He was a predator operating at full efficiency. The gray hair and the modest manner were simply the latest iteration of the same disguise he had been wearing since Morelia. The trial of Francisco DeMarco was held on October 31, 1984, a date with an unintended but distinctly appropriate atmospheric quality, given what was being adjudicated. The courtroom proceedings confronted the totality of his documented crimes: the murder of Iracema Rubino dos Santos in 1953, the murders of the unidentified 14-year-old girl and Antonio Carlos Fernandez in 1961 in Ponte Nova, the murders of Alberto Antonio Antonelli, Jose Noguera Neto, Maria Marcia de Lima Carvalho, and Loisir de Silva in Rio Claro between 1982 and 1984. 7 children across 31 years across 2 states across 3 separate criminal episodes, each one interrupted by imprisonment and each one resumed the moment those imprisonments ended or were escaped. The sentence handed down on October 31, 1984, was 70 years. 70 years of imprisonment, representing the court's attempt to express in the only language available to it the full weight of what Francisco DeMarco had done. Whether 70 years felt adequate to the families of the 7 children who would never grow up is a question that law is structurally unable to answer, because law deals in equivalencies and there are crimes for which no equivalency exists. What happened to Francisco DeMarco after that sentencing is not definitively known. The records that document his life with any degree of completeness effectively end on October 31, 1984. He was born in 1922, which would have made him 62 years old at the time of sentencing. 70 additional years of imprisonment placed his theoretical release date somewhere in the middle of the 21st century. A number so far beyond any reasonable human lifespan that the sentence functioned, in practical terms, as life imprisonment. It is widely presumed that he died in custody, though no confirmed date of death has been established in the publicly available record. The victims, by contrast, are permanently fixed in their ages. Iracema Rubino dos Santos remains 7 years old in every photograph, every record, every memory. Alberto Antonio Antonelli remains 11. Jose Nogueira Neto remains 9. Maria Marcia de Lima Carvalho remains 9. Loisir de Silva remains 11. The unidentified 14-year-old girl from Ponte Nova remains 14 and unnamed, which is perhaps the most haunting designation of all. A child who has not even been granted the permanence of being known by her name in the documented history of her own murder. Antonio Carlos Fernandez, the boy who witnessed one murder and was subsequently hunted down, shot twice, and burned. He remains a child in the record, fixed at an age that should not have been his final one. 7 children, 7 lives that terminated far too early, far too violently, at the hands of a man who was given multiple opportunities to be stopped and walked through each open door with the patient confidence of someone who understood that the world was not paying close enough attention. The city of Rio Claro carried the weight of this story for years after the arrest. By the early 1990s, when another killer would emerge and begin targeting children in and around the Edmundo Navarro de Andrade State Forest, the same forest where DeMarco had disposed of Alberto Antonelli, the city's first instinct was to assume that DeMarco had somehow returned. He was in prison, but the fear had taken the shape of his name, and his name attached itself automatically to the particular horror of a child gone missing near those trees. It is a measure of the depth of the psychological wound he inflicted on that community that even imprisoned, even years removed, his specter could descend upon a city and reactivate its darkest memories. The investigators who worked the Rio Claro cases, the officers from Morelia who made the connection between the 1984 murders and the 1953 killing of Iracema, the prosecutors who assembled the evidence in a courtroom on Halloween. These individuals did their jobs under conditions of considerable difficulty. The records were fragmented. The time between crimes was vast. The suspect had changed his identity. The parole system had introduced him into an environment with insufficient warning or oversight. And yet the case was built. The evidence held. The verdict was delivered. Whatever failures preceded the final arrest itself was the result of sustained, professional investigative work that deserves acknowledgement. But the larger failure, the systemic, institutional failure, remains. Francisco DeMarco was not a case that arrived without warning signs. He was a documented criminal sexual predator who had murdered a child, been convicted, escaped, murdered 2 more, been convicted, and then been released on parole. Each conviction carried within it all the information necessary to understand that Francisco DeMarco should never have been in proximity to children again. The information was there. The history was there. The pattern was inarguably there. And yet the children of Rio Claro paid for the system's failure to act on what it already knew. The Edmundo Navarro de Andrade State Forest, where Alberto Antonelli's body was found, still stands outside Rio Claro. It is a vast and in many ways beautiful landscape of eucalyptus, a managed forest that serves ecological and recreational purposes. It is also a place where something irreversible happened, where a child was discarded by a man who had decided that his own compulsions outweighed the value of a human life. Visitors who walk those paths today almost certainly do not think about Alberto Antonelli, but the forest knows, and the families know, and the record knows. Grief of this particular kind, the grief of violent, preventable loss, does not dissolve with the passage of time, transforms. It becomes part of the infrastructure of a family's identity, a foundational trauma that reshapes everything downstream of it. The siblings of these 7 children grew up with the particular weight of a death that was not natural, that was not accidental, that was chosen by another human being who evaluated the life of their brother or sister and decided it was expendable. That weight does not lift. It simply becomes something the living learn to carry. When history examines the case of Francisco DeMarco with the full analytical attention it demands, certain themes emerge that are neither comforting nor easy to dismiss. These are not themes unique to Brazil or to the 1950s or the 1980s. They are patterns that repeat across the landscape of serial predation with such consistency that they function almost as a diagnostic framework for understanding how cases like his happen and, more critically, how they are enabled to continue long past the point at which they should have been permanently stopped. The first and most foundational of these patterns is the gap between what the system knows and what it acts upon. Francisco DeMarco's criminal record, visible in its entirety only in retrospect, reads as an escalating series of clear, unambiguous warning signals. A prior conviction for sexual crimes before his first murder. The rape and murder of a 7-year-old girl in 1953. An escape from prison after serving a fraction of his sentence. 2 murders committed under a false identity in a different state. A 30-year sentence that was interrupted by parole. And then 4 more murders in the city where parole deposited him. The pattern was not hidden. It was documented at every stage. The failure was not a failure of information. It was a failure of response to information that was already in hand. This distinction matters enormously, because the tendency when confronting cases like this is to frame the problem as one of insufficient knowledge. If only we had known more about him, if only the records had been more complete, if only communication between jurisdictions had been more efficient. In the case of Francisco DeMarco, the records were there. The jurisdictions Morelia, Ponte Nova, Guaxup, Sao Paulo's prison system, all had pieces of the same file. What was missing was not information but the institutional will and capacity to synthesize what was already known into a coherent risk assessment that would have produced a different outcome. Parole, as a concept, is not inherently flawed. It exists as a mechanism for reintegrating individuals into society under conditions designed to support rehabilitation and monitor behavior. Its logic is not without foundation. But it is a mechanism that requires accurate, comprehensive, and honestly evaluated input to function safely. When the individual being considered for parole is Francisco DeMarco, a man who had already demonstrated across 3 distinct criminal episodes that freedom equaled violence against children, the mechanism cannot function as designed because the honest evaluation of the available input should have produced a fundamentally different output. The parole board that released him in 1981 presumably did not have access to every layer of his history in the form that we now see it. Records from the 1950s and 1960s, processed across different states and different institutional frameworks, may not have been consolidated into a single legible document. The bureaucratic landscape of Brazilian criminal justice in that era was not equipped with the kind of centralized digital record systems that would later make such cross-referencing more possible. These are real constraints. They do not, however, represent a complete or satisfying explanation for how a convicted child killer who had previously escaped from prison was placed on parole in a city without what appears to have been adequate community warning or meaningful supervision. The second pattern worth examining is the role of community trust in enabling predators of Francisco DeMarco's specific type. The neighborhoods where he lived and operated, Morelia in 1953, Ponte Nova in 1961, Rio Claro from 1981 onward, were not negligent communities. They were ordinary communities populated by ordinary people who operated from ordinary assumptions about the nature of the people around them. The assumption that a man who is quiet and hardworking and courteous is unlikely to be dangerous is not unreasonable. It is, in fact, the kind of assumption that makes daily social life possible. To abandon it entirely would be to exist in a state of constant, exhausting suspicion that is not compatible with functional community life. Francisco DeMarco did not exploit this assumption naively. He cultivated it. The Glacier persona was not accidental or incidental. It was useful. It gave him legitimate reason to be visible in neighborhoods. It established him as someone who worked with his hands, who served a practical function, who could be seen regularly without triggering alarm. The combination of an unremarkable profession, a domestic life, the wife, the 3 children, and an apparently cooperative manner in any institutional setting he occupied, these were not coincidentally assembled. They were the operational infrastructure of a predator who had learned, through years of social navigation, exactly what profile was least likely to attract scrutiny. This is, in the taxonomy of violent offending, sometimes described as the capacity for social camouflage, the ability to present a surface that conforms sufficiently to social expectations that observers engage with the surface rather than looking beneath it. DeMarco was extraordinarily capable in this regard. Not because he was charming in the conventional sense, the record does not describe him as particularly magnetic or socially dominant, but because he was ordinary enough. And ordinary is the greatest camouflage of all. The third pattern, and perhaps the most disturbing in its implications, is what the case of Francisco DeMarco reveals about the specific vulnerability of children who exist at the margins of economic security. Alberto Antonio Antonelli was an 11-year-old shoeshiner. He worked the streets because his family needed supplemental income. That work required him to engage with strangers, to navigate the social landscape of adults who approached him, to make rapid assessments of trustworthiness in exchanges where the power differential was enormous. He had developed, necessarily, a certain fluency in these transactions, but no 11-year-old shoeshiner, however street-aware, had the experiential framework to identify Francisco DeMarco for what he was. José Noguera Neto and Loisir da Silva were also children likely moving through their days with a degree of independence necessitated by economic circumstance. Maria Marcia de Lima Carvalho, 9 years old, may have had slightly different circumstances, but the common thread running through the children of Rio Claro targeted by DeMarco was their accessibility, their presence in public spaces without the immediate buffer of protective adult accompaniment. DeMarco selected for this. He was not approaching children with parents nearby. He was approaching children who were navigating the streets with the self-sufficiency that poverty and necessity produce. This is not a criticism of the families of these children. It is a structural observation. The families of Alberto, Jose, Maria Marcia, and Loisir were not negligent parents. They were people living in circumstances where children contributed to household function by working or moving independently through their communities. What Francisco DeMarco did was to identify this structural feature of working-class Brazilian life in 1982 and exploit it as a hunting strategy. He found children in the spaces where children were least supervised, not because those families cared less, but because those families had less margin for constant supervision. The fourth pattern, and this one carries implications that extend well beyond the case of Francisco DeMarco, is what happens to a community's psychological landscape after an event of this kind. Rio Claro did not recover quickly or cleanly. The murders of 4 children between 1982 and 1984, followed by the revelation that the perpetrator had been living among them on parole, left a mark that persisted for more than a decade. By the early 1990s, when a separate killer, a man named Laert Patrocinio Orpinelli, began committing similar murders in the same region and disposing of bodies in the same Edmundo Navarro de Andrade State Forest where DeMarco had left Alberto Antonelli, the immediate assumption of the Rio Claro community was that DeMarco had somehow returned. He was in prison. But the fear had been so deeply carved into the community's collective memory that it immediately reached for his name when new horror arrived in familiar packaging. This is what sustained trauma does to a community. It creates a template of dread that activates automatically when the conditions that originally generated it appear to recur. The people of Rio Claro were not irrational in reaching for DeMarco's name. They were responding from the deepest available emotional memory, the memory of having been betrayed by a man they had trusted, in the spaces where their children moved freely under circumstances that the system was supposed to have prevented. Francisco DeMarco's legacy, if that word can be used without irony in this context, is a case study in the catastrophic intersection of individual predation and institutional failure. He was not, in the way that some serial killers are, an unknowable, undetectable aberration whose crimes emerged from total concealment. He was a man with a documented history, a paper trail that began in the late 1940s with a sexual crimes conviction and moved forward in time through murder, escape, false identity, additional murders, further imprisonment, and parole. At every stage, the information existed. At every stage, the question must be asked whether the response was proportionate to what that information communicated. The 7 children who died at his hands did not die in isolation from this institutional landscape. Their deaths were not simply the product of one man's compulsions, however severe and however persistent those compulsions clearly were. Their deaths occurred in the specific context created by a series of decisions, legal, administrative, procedural, that returned Francisco DeMarco to communities where children lived. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is not one that redistributes blame away from the man who committed these acts. The moral and legal weight of what he did belongs entirely to him. But accountability in cases like this has more than one dimension. The individual dimension is clear. The systemic dimension is equally important to examine, precisely because it is the dimension that, if honestly engaged with, carries the potential to prevent future versions of the same catastrophe. The children of Rio Claro deserved better. Iracema deserved better. Antonio Carlos Fernandez, the boy who witnessed a murder and was subsequently hunted, shot, and burned, deserved immeasurably better. The unidentified 14-year-old girl from Ponte Nova, who has still not been publicly named in any accessible record, who remains in the documentation of her own murder as simply an unidentified victim, deserved far better than the anonymity that history has imposed upon her. What the case of Francisco DeMarco ultimately demands from the people who study it, who discuss it, who encounter it through channels like this one, is a refusal of comfortable simplification. He was not simply a monster in the fairy tale sense, a recognizable, clearly marked creature that civilized society had merely failed to contain. He was a human being who made choices, who calculated risks, who constructed personas, who operated within communities, who navigated the legal system with enough competence to reduce his sentences through good behavior and to use parole as a vehicle for continued predation. Understanding him as fully human, rather than as something categorically separate from humanity, is more difficult and more important than dismissing him as incomprehensible. Because incomprehensible is a word that allows us to stop looking. And the lesson of Francisco DeMarco is precisely that we cannot afford to stop looking. Not at the individuals who commit these crimes, not at the systems that process them, not at the communities that house them, and not at the children, 7 of them across 3 decades in 3 cities in 2 states, who paid the price for every moment that the looking stopped. His trial concluded on October 31st, 1984. The sentence was 70 years. The courtroom delivered its verdict. Brazil moved forward. The families of 7 children did not move forward in the same sense. They moved differently, altered permanently, carrying something that no verdict and no sentence could address or repair. Francisco DeMarco, the glazier, the monster, the vampire, Darcy Nogueira, presumably died in a Brazilian prison sometime after 1984. The precise date is not confirmed. The world did not mark his passing with anything like the grief it should have permanently reserved for the 7 children he left behind in cornfields and sugarcane and forest. Their names were Iracema. She was 7. Antonio Carlos was a boy who tried to survive a terrible thing he witnessed and was not allowed to. The girl from Ponte Nova was 14 and does not even have her name in the record. Jose was 9. Maria Marcia was 9. Alberto was 11. Loisir was 11. They deserved to grow old. They deserved to see Brazil change and evolve and move through the decades that followed their deaths. They deserved the ordinary, uncelebrated gift of a life lived to its natural length. Francisco DeMarco took that from them. And took it from them not once, not impulsively, not in a single moment of catastrophic judgment, but repeatedly, deliberately, across 31 years and 3 waves of destruction, each made possible by a world that was not quite paying close enough attention. The glass man shattered things he had no right to touch, and unlike the windows he repaired for a living, what he broke could never, under any circumstances, be put back. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our 3rd story. Story 3. The Devil's Craftsman. The Blood Rituals of Jose Vicente Matias, a.k.a. Corumbá, the beach maniac of Brazil. He made jewelry with his hands, traveled freely across Brazil like any ordinary wanderer, smiled at strangers, and charmed his way into trust, all while carrying a darkness so profound, so bottomless, that even seasoned investigators who spent decades reviewing the worst of humanity had to step away from the case file, close their eyes, and breathe. Somewhere between the sun-scorched beaches of Maranhão, the colonial cobblestones of Goiás, and the dusty backroads of Minas Gerais, a man walked freely among the living, leaving behind nothing but broken bodies, scattered bones, and the faint, nauseating evidence that he had consumed parts of the women he murdered. Not metaphorically, Not symbolically, literally. He drank their blood. He ate portions of their brains. He danced over what remained. And when police finally asked him why, he looked them in the eye and told them, without flinching, that the devil had given him a mission, and he was simply following orders. This is the true story of José Vicente Matias, known across Brazil by his chilling alias, Corumbá, a wandering artisan, a quiet craftsman, and one of the most disturbing serial killers to ever move through South America's most breathtaking landscapes, turning beauty into burial ground and trust into a weapon sharper than any blade. He was not a monster hiding in shadows. He was the man sitting next to you at the market, the one selling handmade bracelets, smiling warmly, offering you a conversation. And by the time you realized what he truly was, it was already far too late. Brazil is a country of staggering contrast. Its landscapes shift from dense Amazon jungle to vast coastal stretches of white sand, from colonial-era town squares to modern cities humming with noise and life. People travel its interior roads by the millions. Backpackers, hippies, artisans, spiritual seekers, tourists from every corner of the globe drawn to the warmth of its culture and the myth of its freedom. It is within this very freedom, this open and trusting culture, that José Vicente Matias found his hunting ground. He was born on September 24, 1966, in Firminópolis, a small municipality in the state of Goiás, deep in the Brazilian interior. From early on, Matias existed on the margins, not the kind of person who drew attention in crowds, not someone who commanded rooms or left lasting impressions in the usual sense. He was the kind of man who was simply there and then gone and then, strangely, there again somewhere else entirely. He drifted. He moved. He carried his tools and his materials and set up wherever people gathered, selling handmade jewelry and crafts, blending into the transient communities of artisans and wanderers that populated Brazil's tourist circuits. To call him ordinary would, on the surface, not be entirely wrong. He worked with his hands. He traveled light. He spoke to people easily. He inhabited a subculture built on openness and communal trust, a world where strangers were welcomed without question and journeys were shared without suspicion. This was the world he had learned to navigate, not with genuine warmth, but with calculated patience. He understood that trust was currency, and he spent it slowly, carefully, never rushing. But beneath the surface, something had been rotting for years. Before the killings that would define his name in criminal history, Matias had already given law enforcement every reason to watch him closely. He had been arrested previously for rape and violent assault, crimes that should have placed him firmly on the radar of investigators across multiple Brazilian states. Yet, in the sprawling geography of Brazil, where communication between regional police forces was inconsistent at best and completely absent at worst, records did not always travel the way criminals did. Matias moved between states like water between cracks, and the legal history that should have followed him often lagged far behind. By 1999, he was already a man whose violence had found its shape. Whatever internal conflict or restraint may have existed before had by then been abandoned entirely. The mission, as he would later describe it in chilling testimony, had begun. The first known victim was Natalia Canjas Carneiro, just 15 years old, a young girl from Minas Gerais, still at an age where the world feels large and navigable and full of possibility. She was killed in September of 1999 in the municipality of Três Marias, a small riverside town along the São Francisco River. The details of exactly how Matias encountered her, how he gained proximity, and the precise sequence of events in those final hours of her life are details that investigators would piece together only years later, largely from Matias's own confessions. Confessions that were inconsistent, disturbing, and deliberately designed to confuse. What is known is that she was murdered. Her life, still so close to its beginning, ended violently at the hands of a man nearly 3 decades her senior, a man who would later reference supernatural justification for what he had done. 15 years old. The São Francisco River continued to flow past Três Marias as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The months that followed the first murder were months in which Matias continued his wandering. He did not flee. He did not retreat into hiding. He traveled, as he always had, moving between markets and festivals and tourist spots, selling his crafts, engaging with strangers, playing the role of the harmless, drifting artisan. There is something profoundly unsettling about this, not just the audacity, but the ease of it. He was not tormented by what he had done, not visibly. He moved forward, looking ahead to whatever darkness was waiting. By June of 2000, he was in Bahia, in the historic municipality of Lençóis, a jewel of the Chapada Diamantina, a region of extraordinary natural beauty, canyons, waterfalls, crystal-clear pools carved into ancient rock. Tourists flocked there. Hippie communities had settled into its rhythms for decades. It was exactly the kind of place where a traveling artisan named Matias would not raise a single eyebrow. His second victim was Simone Lima Pinho, 26 years old. Herself a hippie and a fellow artisan from Bahia, she was part of the world Matias had learned to inhabit. She may have recognized him as someone familiar, another wanderer, another craftsperson, someone who understood the nomadic life. Whatever interaction preceded her death, it ended in extraordinary violence. Simone was beaten and then stoned to death. The brutality of the method. The use of a stone, something drawn directly from the earth beneath their feet in one of Brazil's most visually stunning natural settings, adds a dimension of horror that is difficult to articulate. The same landscape that drew people searching for peace and beauty became the site of something that defied both entirely. Simone Lima Pinho was 26 years old. She had chosen a life of movement and craft and community. She had done nothing to deserve what found her in Lençóis. After the second murder, Matias disappeared back into the fabric of Brazilian travel. For the next few years, the full picture of his movements remains partially obscured. He traveled, he sold his jewelry, he spoke to people, he watched. Whatever he was doing during those intermediate years, he was not stopping. He was, in his own disturbed understanding, continuing a mission. The name Corumbá, his alias, is a place name in Brazil, a city in Mato Grosso do Sul on the Bolivian border. Why he adopted it, whether it carried personal significance or was merely a convenient alias, is part of the broader fog that surrounds his psychology. In his testimonies, he would shift between explanations for his crimes, sometimes citing dark spiritual compulsion, the voice of the devil directing his actions, other times referencing rage at xenophobia directed toward him, at mockery of his impotence, at humiliations small and large that he had absorbed over years. Neither explanation is sufficient. Neither explanation is meant to be. Men like Matias do not offer clean explanations because there are none. The darkness they carry is not logical. It does not follow a script that satisfies the human need for reason. What investigators would eventually understand, after his arrest, was that the murders were not random explosions of sudden rage. They were deliberate. They were structured around opportunity, geography, and a specific type of victim. Women, usually encountered in isolated or semi-isolated settings, often in the context of the backpacker and artisan communities that Matias used as camouflage. He targeted people who trusted strangers. He targeted communities built on openness. He targeted the very values of freedom and wandering that, in Brazilian counterculture especially, represented the best of human connection. He turned that openness into a killing field. By the time the investigation would eventually catch up to him, the trail stretched across multiple Brazilian states. Minas Gerais, Bahia, Goiás, Maranhão, an arc of violence that mapped neatly onto the same tourist and artisan circuits he had traveled for years. The geography of his crimes was the geography of his life. He killed where he lived. He killed where he worked. He killed in some of the most beautiful places in Brazil, and left those places permanently altered in the memory of everyone who would later learn what had occurred there. And through all of it, he continued to make jewelry. He continued to set up his stall, lay out his crafts, smile at the people who approached, and sell them something beautiful, something made by the same hands that had taken lives. The audacity of that image. The smiling artisan, the wandering craftsman, the man who drank blood and ate brains and danced over bodies and then returned to his market stall the following morning, is the kind of image that refuses to leave the mind once it has entered it. It was not finished, not even close. Corumbá still had names to add to his list. and in his darkest testimony, he claimed he had been told to kill 7. He had only reached 2. The road ahead was longer and bloodier than anyone yet understood. Brazil's beautiful, sprawling, sun-drenched interior stretched on in every direction, full of women who did not yet know his name, full of places that had not yet been touched by what he carried. And Matias, patient, wandering, smiling, was already moving toward the next one. The years between 2000 and 2004 represent a gap in the confirmed victim record that may never be fully closed. Brazilian law enforcement, spread thin across an enormous country, working with limited resources and fragmented communication between states, was not yet connecting the dots. There was no single task force hunting a serial killer. There was no urgent nationwide alert. There were scattered reports, missing persons, unsolved cases, the ordinary statistical noise of violence in a country struggling with many crises at once. Matias understood this. Whether consciously or instinctively, he operated within the silences of the system. He moved when moving was safe. He paused when pausing was necessary. He was, in his grotesque way, disciplined. And the discipline of a man willing to drink the blood of a bound teenager and call it a religious mission is a discipline that should make the skin crawl, because it suggests not madness in the explosive, uncontrolled sense, but something far more terrifying, deliberate, reasoned, sustained evil. The next chapter of his story was about to open, and it would be the darkest one yet. There are cases in criminal history that disturb investigators not because of the scale of the body count alone, but because of what the killings reveal about the mind behind them. The murder of Lidian Vieira de Mello, 16 years old, is one of those cases, a crime so methodical in its cruelty, so prolonged in its horror, that it stands in a category almost entirely its own. It was January of 2004. Goiânia, the capital of Goiás state, was a city of nearly 1 million people, sprawling and modern, a contrast to the colonial towns and wild landscapes where Matias had committed earlier crimes. Lidian was from Goiânia, a young woman of 16, still a child by any reasonable standard, with whatever dreams and ordinary concerns filled the days of teenagers navigating a complicated world. She encountered José Vicente Matias, and for a day and a half, 36 hours, she did not die. That sentence alone deserves to sit in silence for a moment. A day and a half, 36 hours of captivity, bound, while Matias, the artisan, the wanderer, the man who had by now been killing for 5 years, drank her blood. The method by which he sustained this act, the way he extracted blood from a living, bound 16-year-old over the course of more than a full day, is the kind of detail that refuses to be sanitized by clinical language. She was alive. She was aware. She was held. And he fed on her. Not in a metaphorical sense of control or dominance, but literally, physically, taking her blood into his body, repeatedly over hours. Investigators reviewing this case would later describe it as one of the most protracted and intimate acts of predatory violence in the Brazilian criminal record. The duration alone marks it as something beyond impulse. Matias was not in a rage. He was not acting from sudden, uncontrollable compulsion. He was patient. He was present. He was doing exactly what he intended to do, for as long as he intended to do it. When Lidian Vieira de Mello finally died, her suffering was not yet over, because Matias then dismembered her body. He took apart what remained of the girl who had been bound in his presence for 36 hours, cutting through flesh and bone with a methodical precision that spoke to experience and premeditation. Whether he consumed portions of her body as he had with later victims is not definitively confirmed in available records, but the act of dismemberment itself served a practical purpose: concealment. He was destroying evidence. He was making identification difficult. He was, in his twisted way, cleaning up. 16 years old, 36 hours, gone. The case of Lidian represents a turning point in Matias's arc. Not because the violence escalated dramatically from earlier crimes, but because the ritualistic quality became more defined, more structured. The drinking of blood was not a spontaneous act. It was a practice, and practices, by definition, are things that are repeated, refined, and embedded into a pattern of behavior. Corumbá had developed his rituals. He was, in his own disturbed cosmology, perfecting them. This is the point in the narrative where his own explanations become important to examine, not to accept, not to excuse, but to understand the architecture of his self-justification. In police testimony, Matthias described himself as receiving whispered instructions from the devil. The voice, he said, had given him a mission with a specific number: 7 women. He was to kill 7. The why was not fully elaborated upon in ways that made logical sense, and this is deliberate. Men who construct supernatural justifications for violence are not providing explanations. They are providing shields. The claim of demonic instruction serves to distance the individual from the responsibility of choice. If the devil told you to do it, then you are merely an instrument, not an agent. You bear no more guilt than the stone used to beat Simone Lima Pinho in the hills of Bahia. Brazilian prosecutors and investigators were not sympathetic to this framing. And they should not have been. Whatever Matthias heard or believed or performed for the benefit of interrogators, the murders were his. The hands that bound Lydian were his. The mouth that drank her blood was his. The mind that sustained that act for 36 hours was his. But the supernatural narrative is worth dwelling on briefly because it reveals something about who Matthias presented himself to be. Within the artisan and traveler communities he inhabited, spirituality was not unusual. Brazil is a country of extraordinary religious diversity, where Afro-Brazilian traditions, Catholicism, Spiritism, and folk belief all coexist and intertwine. The landscape Matthias moved through was one where spiritual discussions were common, where ritual carried real cultural weight, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were more porous in everyday conversation than they might be elsewhere. He had learned the language of that world. He spoke it fluently, and he may have used it, not as genuine belief, but as cover, as a way to engage potential victims in conversations about spirit and energy and the sacred that made him appear to belong to their world rather than threaten it. On other occasions during testimony, the supernatural explanation disappeared entirely. Instead, Matthias spoke of xenophobia, of being mocked, ridiculed, treated as lesser because of where he came from, who he was. He spoke of humiliation over sexual impotence, of women who had laughed at him, dismissed him, made him feel the shame of inadequacy. In this version of his story, the killings were not demonic missions but revenge, against women specifically, against the wound to his ego that their contempt or indifference had inflicted. Both explanations are contradictory. Both are incomplete. Both may contain shreds of something real. But neither is sufficient, and neither should be used to generate sympathy for a man who held a teenager captive for 36 hours and drank her blood. The next confirmed victim after Lydian was Katrin Rakitov, 29 years old, a Russian-Israeli woman killed in Pirenópolis, Goiás, another spectacular colonial town, one of Brazil's most visited historical destinations, known for its 18th-century architecture, its surrounding Cerrado landscape, its festivals, and its spiritual community. Pirenópolis drew exactly the kind of cosmopolitan, open, spiritually curious traveler that populated Matthias's world. The exact circumstances of Katrin's encounter with Matthias, the method of her killing, and the full details of what was done to her body have not been entirely documented in publicly available records. What is confirmed is that she was murdered in Pirenópolis, that Matthias was responsible, and that she was 29 years old, a young woman from 2 countries, a traveler who had made her way to one of Brazil's most beautiful colonial towns, and who never made it home. The international dimension of her death, a Russian-Israeli woman killed in Goiás, was significant. Foreign nationals murdered in Brazil trigger different levels of attention, different diplomatic pressures, different investigative urgencies. And yet Katrin's death did not immediately become the catalyst for the capture of the man responsible. Matthias moved on. He was, by this point in 2004, a man who had killed at least 4 women across multiple states, who had consumed blood and dismembered bodies, who had a prior criminal record for rape and assault, and who was still free, still traveling, still selling jewelry, still smiling. The year 2004 alone contained multiple murders. The pace was accelerating. Whether this reflected increased confidence, decreased caution, or simply the statistical reality that more time spent killing meant more victims, the result was the same. More women were dying across more territory, at the hands of a man who had perfected the art of belonging everywhere while being truly known by no one. The state of Maranhão, in Brazil's northeast, would become the final killing ground, the place where Corumba's violence reached its most theatrical, most ritualistic extreme, and the place where the trail he left behind became impossible to ignore. Maranhão is a state of haunting beauty. Its capital, São Luís, is a UNESCO World Heritage City of colonial Portuguese architecture and Afro-Brazilian culture. Its interior contains the Lençóis Maranhenses National Park, an impossible landscape of white sand dunes and crystal lagoons that seems to belong to a different planet. Its coast, including the area around Alcântara and the Baía de São Marcos, is remote, wild, sparsely populated. Exactly the kind of landscape that attracted adventurous travelers willing to leave the beaten path behind. Exactly the kind of landscape that offered solitude, privacy, isolation. This was where Corumba came in 2004 and 2005. And this was where he chose to kill the last two women on what he described as his list, including the one whose murder, perhaps more than any other, shocked the world outside Brazil's borders and finally forced the investigation to reach a conclusion. But before the final act, there was Marianne Kern, 49 years old, a German tourist. Marianne had traveled to Maranhão drawn by the same extraordinary beauty that called so many international visitors to its shores. She was found in a shallow grave in the municipality of Barreirinhas, the gateway town to the Lençóis Maranhenses National Park, a place now as strongly associated in Brazilian criminal memory with this woman's death, as it is with the otherworldly dunes that made it famous. 49 years old, German, someone's mother, perhaps. Someone's daughter, certainly. Someone who had traveled a great distance to see something beautiful, to stand in a landscape unlike anywhere else on earth, and who was instead put in the ground by a man who drank blood and danced over bodies and claimed divine instruction. The shallow grave speaks to a different phase of Matias's behavior. Earlier killings had involved some degree of post-mortem concealment, but the shallow graves of Maranhão suggest both haste and confidence. The haste of someone who was moving on quickly, and the confidence of someone who did not believe he would be found. He was wrong, but not immediately. The final murder on the confirmed list was still ahead, and it was the one that would finally change everything. The beach of Itatinga, near the municipality of Alcântara in Maranhão, is the kind of place that belongs in a dream. Alcântara itself is a ghost town of breathtaking melancholy, a former colonial capital slowly being reclaimed by jungle and time, its ruins standing in the heat like monuments to something that once was. The surrounding coastline is remote and largely inaccessible, reachable only by boat across the Baía de São Marcos, a place where the water stretches silver in the morning light and the silence is complete. It was on the beach of Itatinga that José Vicente Matias killed Núria Fernandes Caleda. Núria was 27 years old. She was Spanish. From Spain, a young woman who had come to Brazil with the spirit of a traveler, drawn to the country's culture, its landscapes, its warmth. She had made it to one of the most remote and strikingly beautiful corners of the country. She had made it to a beach that most Brazilians have never seen, reached by water, surrounded by forest, with the ruins of Alcântara visible in the distance on the far shore. She encountered Matias. And what followed was not simply a murder. It was a ritual. Matias killed Núria Fernandes Caleda with blows to the head, the same blunt force method that had taken Simone Lima Pinho years earlier, the same brutal, physical, intimate form of killing that required proximity, commitment, and the absolute surrender of any last fragment of conscience. He struck her until she was dead, on a remote beach at the edge of the world. And then he consumed portions of her brain, and he drank her blood. And then he danced. This detail, the dance, is the one that most defies language. The investigation would later confirm through Matias's own testimony that after killing Núria and consuming parts of her, he performed what he described as a ritual dance. He moved his body over and around her remains, enacting something that existed inside his private and deranged cosmology, something that felt to him like completion, like ceremony, like the fulfillment of a mission. A 27-year-old Spanish woman on a beautiful Brazilian beach. and a man dancing over what remained of her. The murder of Nuria Fernandes Caleda was the one that broke the case open. Foreign nationals murdered in Brazil carry diplomatic weight. A Spanish citizen killed and cannibalized on a Maranhão beach was not something that could be absorbed quietly into the statistical noise of unsolved crimes. The Spanish government took notice. Brazilian federal authorities took notice. The investigation that had been moving slowly across multiple states suddenly had momentum, direction, and pressure. Investigators began connecting the threads that had been scattered across years and geography. The murders in Três Marias, in Lençóis, in Goiânia, in Pirenópolis, in Barreirinhas, the victims who had died at different times in different states began to resolve into a pattern. A traveling artisan. A man who moved between tourist and hippie communities. A man known by the alias Corumbá. A man who had prior arrests for rape and violent assault and who had somehow never been stopped before the body count reached 6. The Brazilian police worked across state lines, pooling information, following the circuits of the artisan communities, tracking the informal networks of people who moved between festivals and markets. Matias was known in these circles, not as a murderer, but as a familiar face, someone who had been around for years, someone whose presence was unremarkable. This very unremarkability had been his armor. Now it became a liability because people could place him. People remembered him. People could describe where he had been and when. The net tightened through early 2005. On March 29, 2005, José Vicente Matias, Corumbá, the beach maniac, the devil's craftsman, the wandering artisan who had moved through some of Brazil's most beautiful landscapes, leaving bodies in shallow graves and sacred rituals smeared in blood, was arrested. The capture, when it came, was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no foot chase through colonial streets, no dramatic armed standoff on a sun-bleached beach. He was found. He was taken. The hands that had beaten, bound, dismembered, and consumed were placed in restraints, and the traveling finally stopped. What followed the arrest was a series of interrogations that would prove both illuminating and deeply frustrating. Matias talked. He talked extensively, at times eagerly, the way some killers do when the pretense of ordinary life has finally collapsed and there is nothing left to protect. But he did not talk consistently. His statements shifted. He contradicted himself. He described demonic instruction on one occasion and wounded pride on another. He described specific victims with apparent clarity and then confused details, muddied timelines, inserted inconsistencies that may have been deliberate attempts to undermine prosecutorial cases or may have reflected a mind that had genuinely fragmented under the weight of its own history. He mentioned the number 7. He claimed he had been commanded to kill 7 women. He had, by the confirmed record, killed 6. Whether a 7th victim exists, unidentified, unconnected, buried somewhere in the vast Brazilian interior, is a question that was never definitively answered. The possibility of an unknown victim haunts the case file the way such possibilities always haunt the most mobile of killers, with the specific dread of knowing that the full truth may never fully surface. What also emerged during the investigation was the dimension of his prior criminal record. The earlier arrests for rape and violent assault that should, in a properly connected and communicating justice system, have flagged him as a significant danger long before 1999. This is one of the most painful elements of the José Vicente Matias case. Not just the brutality of what he did, but the preventability that glints coldly underneath the entire narrative. He had shown what he was before the killing began. The system had encountered him, and then it had let him walk back into the roads of Brazil to continue. This is not a criticism without complexity. Brazil's challenges with law enforcement coordination across 27 states and an enormous, diverse geography are well documented. The failures that allowed Matias to kill 6 women before being caught are systemic failures as much as individual ones. Failures of communication, of record sharing, of resource allocation. But systemic failures have human costs, and the human costs in this case had names. Natalia, Simone, Lydian, Katrin, Marianne, Nuria. The investigation also had to navigate the geography of evidence. Crime scenes spread across 4 states, some of them remote and time-degraded by the time investigators formally connected them to Matias. Physical evidence had been partially destroyed by the elements, by the passage of years, by the acts of dismemberment and concealment that Matias had undertaken methodically. Building a prosecutable case from this scattered, aged, partially destroyed evidence required painstaking work. But it was done. Slowly, carefully, the prosecutors assembled what they needed. And José Vicente Matias, sitting in custody, oscillating between supernatural claims and grievance narratives, could not undo the trail he had left across the map of Brazil. He had danced on a beach in Maranhão while a Spanish woman's blood was still warm on his hands. He had bound a 16-year-old girl for 36 hours while he fed on her. He had beaten women with stones in the valleys of Bahia and buried them in the sand of the northeast coast. He had left marks on some of the most beautiful places in one of the world's most beautiful countries. Marks that no amount of dancing or devil-blaming would erase. The reckoning had arrived, and the next step was the courtroom. The trial of José Vicente Matias would not be brief. Cases of this complexity, multi-state, multi-victim, involving an accused who gave contradictory testimony and a record scattered across years of imperfect documentation, take time. They take the kind of methodical, exhausting legal work that happens without cameras, without drama, line by line through evidence and testimony and counterargument. But the outcome, when it came, was not in doubt. The courtroom proceedings against José Vicente Matias, Corumbá, the man who had drifted through Brazil's most iconic landscapes leaving death behind him, unfolded with the particular weight that attaches to cases where the full horror is already known before the legal process begins. This was not a case where guilt was in question. The evidence was substantial. The accused had, at various points, confirmed key details of the crimes himself. The question before the court was not whether he had done these things, but how the law would account for them. Brazilian criminal law has its own architecture, shaped by the country's legal tradition and its specific penal code. Sentences in Brazil for multiple murders do not accumulate in the way they do in some other jurisdictions. The system has its own logic, its own limits, its own framework for calculating what justice looks like when the crimes are this numerous and this severe. The process was not swift. More than 3 years separated Matias's arrest in March 2005 from the delivery of the court sentence. On June 2, 2008, José Vicente Matias was sentenced to 23 years in prison. 23 years for 6 lives. For Natalia, 15 years old, murdered in 1999 in Três Marias. For Simone, 26 years old, beaten and stoned to death in the valleys of Bahia. For Lydian, 16 years old, bound for 36 hours while Corumbá drank her blood in a city of nearly 1 million people. For Katrin, 29 years old, killed in Pirenópolis. For Marianne, 49 years old, buried in the sand near the white dunes of Maranhão. For Núria, 27 years old, killed on a beach at the edge of the world while a man performed a ritual dance over her remains. 23 years. The response to this sentence, in Brazil and among the international communities connected to the foreign victims, was not uniformly satisfied. The gap between the sentence and the magnitude of the crimes it addressed was visible and disturbing to many. 23 years for 6 murders, for cannibalism, for the dismemberment of a bound teenager, for a series of ritualistic crimes that spanned half a decade and 4 states. The mathematics of the sentence felt profoundly inadequate to those who calculated it against the specific, named, irreplaceable lives it was meant to address. This reaction is understandable. It is also the kind of reaction that points to one of the most enduring tensions in criminal justice. The gap between what punishment can actually accomplish and what it represents to those who have lost the most. Sentences are legal instruments, not emotional balances. They cannot give back what was taken. They cannot undo the 36 hours Lydian spent bound and alive. They cannot return Núria Fernandez Caleta to her family in Spain. They cannot restore Natalia Canjas Carneiro to the 15-year-old girl who had a whole life in front of her in Minas Gerais. What the sentence did accomplish was practical. It placed José Vicente Matias inside a cell, removed from the roads and markets and beaches of Brazil, no longer capable of completing whatever count he believed he had been assigned. The seventh woman on his list, the one he claimed the devil had demanded, would not be found in a shallow grave. That much the sentence achieved. The question of the seventh victim deserves extended consideration. During his testimony, Matthias stated that he had been instructed to kill 7 women. He had killed 6 by the confirmed record. Whether a 7th victim exists, unknown and unconnected to his name, is something investigators could never fully rule out. Serial killers who operate across wide geographies and long time frames often leave cases behind them that are never conclusively linked. Unsolved murders in the regions Matthias traveled through during the years between his confirmed killings cannot be automatically attributed to him, but they cannot be automatically excluded either. The question of what happened in the years between Simone Lima Pinu in 2000 and Lidian Vieira de Mello in 2004 remains partially open. That is 4 years during which Matthias was traveling, alive, free, and by his own account on a mission. 4 years in which the only confirmed murders are at either end of the gap. The interior of that gap is uncertain, and uncertainty of this kind, in cases like this, is its own particular form of horror. It is the horror of not knowing, of wondering, of looking at unsolved cases in Goiás or Bahia or Minas Gerais during those years and asking the silent, unanswerable question. Was this him? Did anyone else encounter Corumbá during those 4 silent years and not survive the encounter? Are there names that belong on this list that we simply do not have? These questions were not definitively answered at trial. They may never be. The case of José Vicente Matias did several things beyond the immediate facts of arrest and sentencing. It exposed, sharply and painfully, the vulnerabilities of Brazil's vast geography when it comes to tracking mobile criminals. The artisan and hippie communities that Matias moved through, communities built on freedom, trust, and openness, were forced to confront the terrifying reality that those very values could be weaponized by someone willing to exploit them without conscience. The foreign victims, Katrin Rakitov, Marion Kern, Núria Fernandes Caleta, brought international attention to the specific dangers facing women travelers in isolated parts of Brazil and sparked ongoing conversations about safety infrastructure for tourists in remote regions. The case also contributed to evolving discussions within Brazilian law enforcement about interstate communication, about the importance of centralized databases for repeat offenders, about the catastrophic potential consequences of failing to track a man with prior rape and assault convictions who continues to move freely across state lines. These are institutional lessons written in blood, lessons that cost 6 lives to learn. In terms of its place in Brazilian criminal history, the case occupies a specific and disturbing niche. Brazil has known serial killers. The country's size and social complexity have produced cases that span the full range of human violence. But Matias, known as Corumbá and the Beach Maniac, represents a particular convergence of factors that makes his case stand apart. The ritualistic dimension of the killings, the cannibalistic acts, the use of tourist and artisan communities as hunting grounds, the international scope created by foreign victims, and the extraordinary geographic range of the crimes. He was not the most prolific killer in Brazilian history by body count, but the nature of what he did and the cultural and social landscape he moved through while doing it gave his case a particular resonance that has persisted. A film adaptation was eventually made. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime content in Portuguese have returned to his story repeatedly in the years since his conviction. The name Corumbá, in Brazilian true crime circles, carries immediate weight. The weight of the beach at Itatinga, of the dunes near Barreirinhas, of the colonial streets of Pirenópolis, of all the beautiful places he touched and permanently darkened. For the victims' families, the story did not end with the sentence, and it did not end with the cultural memory. For the family of Natalia Canjas Carneiro, a 15-year-old girl killed in 1999, whose family had to wait 9 years from her murder before a sentence was delivered. The case extended across a decade of waiting, of grief, of watching the legal system move at its own pace through the wreckage of something that had changed their lives in September 1999 and never let them return to what they were before. For the family of Núria Fernandes Caleta in Spain, the knowledge of what happened to their 27-year-old in Brazil, on a remote beach at the hands of a man who consumed parts of her and danced, is knowledge that no sentence adequately addresses, no document sufficiently contains, no distance fully softens. For Simone Lima Pinu's community in Bahia, for Lydian Vieira de Melo's family in Guyana, for those who knew Marion Kern and Katrin Rakitov, across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple cultures, the case left marks that remain. José Vicente Matias, born in Firminopolis, Goiás, on September 24, 1966, spent his adult life moving through Brazil with an artisan's tools and a predator's patience. He wore the costume of community and belonging while systematically destroying both. He used the trust of wanderers and seekers against them, turning the open roads of a beautiful country into corridors of danger. He claimed the devil whispered in his ear. He claimed humiliation drove his hands. He claimed a mission with a specific number. None of it matters in the end, not because explanations are irrelevant, but because no explanation changes what was done to 6 human beings across 6 years in 4 Brazilian states. Natalia, 15. Simone, 26. Lydian, 16. Katrin, 29. Marianne, 49. Nuria, 27. 6 women, 6 lives, 6 families permanently altered. And somewhere, in the slow passage of the years that followed his sentencing, in a prison somewhere in Brazil, the man who drank blood on the banks of the São Francisco River, who stoned a woman in the Chapada of Bahia, who kept a teenager bound for a day and a half while he fed on her, who danced over a Spanish woman's body on a remote Maranhão beach, continued to exist. The artisan, the wanderer, the devil's errand boy, Corumbá, 23 years. The road is long, but it is no longer open to him. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.